Welcome back. Reuters is reporting that Iran has called on countries not to attend a meeting called by the US at the United Nations Security Council to discuss the protests in Iran. The meeting is being briefed by the Iranian Nobel Prize laureate Shirin Ebadi and the Iranian-born actress and activist Nazanin Vanaidi. Meanwhile, university students in Iran are reported to have gone ahead with sit-down strikes today, ignoring warnings by security forces. The last time Iran saw protests of this nature was the 1979 revolution. The Islamic Republic has faced sustained anti-government demonstrations since a woman died in the custody of what are called the morality police 7 weeks ago. She was arrested for not wearing her hijab correctly. Ayesha Kajee is an analyst. She joins us now. Ayesha, you've just returned from Iran, and good afternoon to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. When these protests first started, the government of Iran warned people against joining the protests. People did so anyway. It warned again and again that it would crack down on these protests, and yet people are still protesting. Again on Sunday they said people must not protest, and yet they're still protesting today. What is it that seems to make these protests different to what's happened in the past?
I think there's a lot of anger and frustration among young people, particularly in Iran. Having said that, Stephen, sometimes what is shown on global news screens is actually different from the reality of what's happening in Iran. For example, I was in my hotel room in Tehran one day watching BBC footage that was purported to have been taken the previous morning around the corner from my hotel in an area where I was actually walking. And there were no protests in that particular place. So sometimes I think there is a sense of hyping up and over-sensationalization over these protests, particularly, Stephen, because they're about the hijab, because they're about something that the West has long sensationalized. On the other hand, there is a very definite sense of acute frustration, even despair among young people in Iran. And it is not entirely about this issue about the hijab or having to, cover their hair because the state says so. That is a symbol. It is really, a lot of the frustration emanates from the deepening and worsening and very severe economic situation in the country, the persistent drought which has fed that economic situation, the sanctions, particularly from the US and the EU. And so there is a whole range of factors that have led to these protests, and the fact that these protests are not going away despite very, very strong-arm tactics by the regime, but despite brutal tactics, really, to be honest, by this regime. So there is a sense that if young people particularly feel that if this doesn't lead anywhere, they're going to be totally without hope. Their futures are going to be dismal. So there is that sense. On the other side of that coin, however, is that normal life in Iran. I've been in Tehran, Shiraz, Isfahan, Yazd, Kashan. Normal life carries on, including among women. And the image that's portrayed in the West is an incorrect one as well, because most Iranian women don't actually cover all their hair. They wear a form of hijab that in many instances leaves 3/4 of their heads uncovered. So, the perception from the outside and the reality on the ground are two very different things in many instances.
I mean, this always tends to happen, but from what I understand, what really caused this was that there had been a tightening of the regulations, or perhaps rather a tightening of the enforcement by what is sort of translated in English by the morality police. If the regime had to now relax and take things, turn back the clock 2 years to how these regulations were implemented then, would that be enough to stop these protests, or do you think it's gone too far?
I think it really depends on the current power struggle internally at the highest levels of Iran's government, particularly amongst the religious establishment. There are those within that establishment who apparently and purportedly, because I've spoken to quite a few people there, want to ease the restrictions on things like women's apparel, want to try and improve the economic situation, want to try some form of rapprochement on the nuclear issue, in returns for easing of sanctions, etc. And then, of course, there are the hardliners. And it's really going to be decided by who wins that internal and quite currently quite covered, quite contained power struggle at the highest levels. If it is the faction, shall we say, that wants to ease restrictions, they won't see it as a defeat for the regime, as the hardliners would, as the so-called morality police would. There were, for example, very, very high tensions in Tehran this visit. I've been in Iran before, Stephen, and certainly here, on several street corners, streets were blocked, there was police presence, there were police in riot gear, etc. I even tried to approach them on a couple of occasions, just, to ask if anybody would speak English, etc., and they were quite brusque and abrupt. Although on one occasion they called somebody who could speak English, and he directed me. I was basically just asking directions. So there is certainly a heightening of tension. There is also a sense, as I said, among young people particularly, that they've had enough of this intertwining of government and religion, to the extent that many of them have become a-religious, which for me as a practicing Muslim is quite sad. So they see government and religion as being so closely intertwined and so harsh on their lives, on their normal civilian everyday lives, that they are rejecting religion. On the other hand, they're also very, very clear, most of them, that they want more voice. They want more say in their lives. They want more freedom of expression, shall we call it. And that includes the freedom to dress the way they want.
Ayesha, very quickly, if we can, as I understand it, the Iranian government's also arrested several journalists who are covering the protests. I mean, that's always going to make the situation a bit more complicated too.
Yes, particularly two journalists who covered the death of Mahsa Amini, one of them covering, the moment when her parents got the news that she was actually dead, the parents embracing one another, the other one covering the actual funeral in Kurdistan, or in the Kurdish part of the country. Both these journalists have been arrested, and this has angered people even more. Both the media organs for which these journalists work have come out to say they were only doing their jobs. There's no reason that they ought to have been arrested. They were covering the death of somebody in custody, which is something journalists do in every country. On the other hand, of course, the regime has seen this as a move by them to abet what the regime sees as the US's in particular, but also the West's agenda and Israel's agenda, they call it, of destabilizing the Iranian regime. And so these two journalists have actually been accused of working for the US spy agency, the CIA, which seems to be, totally unrealistic, totally an equation sucked out of the ether, because nobody, even in Iran, seems to think that either of these two journalists is actually a spy.
Ayesha,
no one that I've spoken to.
Ayesha Kajee, analyst, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the information and the views on the situation in Iran.